a carving knife buried in a pot of boiling noodles, a threatening note that turns a gourmet kitchen into a crime scene. When jealousy simmers and secrets stew, only Nero Wolfe's brilliant mind can separate the flavors of guilt from the truth. Welcome, dear listener. Where are you joining us from today? And what time is it for you, early morning or late at night? Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in, lean back, and prepare your wits. The mystery ahead is rich, layered, and served, like all the best dishes, with a sharp edge. I'd seen Fritz Brenner upset before, once when Wolfe suggested boiling asparagus, and another time when a guest salted the sauce before tasting it. But on that particular Wednesday morning, he entered the office not just flustered, he was rattled. And rattled, Fritz is a disruption to the very spine of Nero Wolfe's brownstone. He held a crumpled note in one hand and what I swear was a stainless steel carving fork in the other, and both trembled slightly. Wolfe was at his desk, flipping through an issue of the Orchid Review, showing no intention of lending his ears to anything terrestrial, let alone culinary panic. Fritz's voice, when it came, was breathy and clipped. "Mr. Wolfe, I must insist you listen. This is not kitchen business as usual." Wolfe didn't lift his eyes. "Then leave it to the police or the Vatican." "No, sir, this is personal." Fritz stepped forward, flattening the note on Wolfe's desk. "Chef Gianni Morelli. You recall I mentioned his visit?" "I recall," Wolfe muttered. "He insists polenta belongs at breakfast." Fritz ignored the jab. "He found this in his kitchen this morning. Someone drove a carving knife into a pot of boiling noodles, and this note beside it, 'Your next dish will be your last.' That did it." Wolfe's eyes lifted just slightly. "And the noodles?" Wolfe asked. "Ruined," Fritz whispered gravely. "It reeks of theatre," Wolfe pronounced, brushing the edge of the paper with his fingertips. "Sensationalism, kitchen melodrama." "Even theatre," I said from my chair across the room, "has its critics stabbed once in a while." Fritz stood like a sentry, silent, pale, and unmoving. Wolfe sighed. The man can ignore a lot: public murder, political corruption, street noise. But Fritz, in quiet agony, is not on that list. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "do sit." "You're bending the air." Fritz obeyed. "It may be theatre," I offered, "but I've seen restaurant tempers get ugly. And you did say Morelli made enemies, the kind that remember family recipes like blood feuds." Wolfe flicked his eyes toward me, mildly offended by my encouragement. "Chef Morelli is a proud man," Fritz interjected. "This was no prank." "No," Wolfe murmured. "But was it intended to kill or to humiliate?" I leaned back. "A knife in noodles is more message than murder." "Yes," Wolfe agreed. "And the message has reached us, against my better judgment." I nudged further. "So we're not dismissing it?" He scowled. "We are entertaining it. There's a difference." I knew then we were in, not because Wolfe believed danger was imminent, but because Fritz had presented him with a puzzle served à la provocation. Fritz rarely invoked his past, but when he did, it often involved cuisine, war, or both. Chef Gianni Morelli, as it turned out, was once a culinary comrade in a small Austrian kitchen commandeered by the Allied forces. While others fought with bayonets and bullets, these two had duelled with broth and wine reductions. That bond, soldered by pressure cookers and rationed butter, had never fully dissolved. "He's not only a master," Fritz said, "he is my brother by flame and salt." "Spare me the poetics," Wolfe said, but there was no sting in it. Fritz continued. "Chef Morelli arrived in New York 2 months ago to open Trattoria di Luca. He has caused a stir. His techniques are bold. His fame has spread. So have his enemies." Wolfe tilted his head. "Such as?" "Riccardo Fontana, for one, accuses Morelli of stealing a gnocchi recipe, and Jasper Nils, the food columnist, publicly embarrassed last week by Morelli's refusal to serve him early." I scratched my chin. A chef with enemies and a flair for showmanship, and now a knife with a message. Wolfe grunted. "And what does Morelli want?" "He hasn't asked for anything," Fritz said, "but I'm asking. I believe someone wishes him harm, and I believe it began with that knife." Wolfe sat in silence. The orchids were quiet, and the room grew heavy with unspoken obligation. Finally, Wolfe leaned back. "Very well, but I will not step foot outside this house. Archie will visit your friend." I nodded. "And if the kitchen stinks," Wolfe added, "I shall trust your nose, Mr. Goodwin, not your palate." Fritz let out a breath he'd been holding for minutes. Wolfe picked up the note again, rereading its scrawl. His lips moved ever so slightly. "Your next dish will be your last," he murmured. Then he looked at me. "Well, Archie, let's see who's cooking what." It took me about half an hour and the usual amount of Wolfe's griping about draft disturbances before I was out the door and heading toward Trattoria di Lucca. The place sat on a corner in the West Village like it had been born there, a squat stucco box with windows full of herbs, lace, and pretense. Inside, the kitchen smelled like genius, disaster, and too many egos in one oven. I arrived just before lunch prep began. Staff buzzed like bees around polished counters. The energy was culinary, but beneath it ran something sour. Tension hung in the air like overcooked garlic. A hostess with cheekbones as sharp as her stilettos brought me back to the kitchen. Chef Morelli stood at the helm, a tall, black-clad figure with sleeves rolled high and a white apron bearing 3 neat, blood-red tomato smudges. The man looked like he'd rather be carving marble than eggplants. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, in a voice smoked in Sicilian vowels, "Fritz told me you'd come." "He did," I replied. "Said you had a problem that needed seasoning with a little wolf." He gave a tired smile. "It started with a knife in my noodles and has not gotten better since." "Someone looking to ruin you?" "Or scare me," he said. "Or both. I have been too successful too quickly. This city has a talent for punishing that." He turned away to stir a bubbling pot. Behind him I noticed several glances, darted and withdrawn, the kind you see in poker games and parliaments. I nodded toward the stove. "You think someone back here has the gall to threaten you in your own kitchen?" "Not gall," he said. "Ambition." Over the next hour, I got acquainted with the inner orbit of Morelli's kitchen, a constellation of talent, tempers, and secrets, all simmering just below a boil. There was Riccardo Fontana, the rival chef who'd accused Morelli of plagiarizing his late mother's gnocchi recipe. He wasn't hard to spot, tall, unsmiling, with arms crossed like a Roman statue, waiting for its moment to behead someone. I caught his eye and gave him a nod. He returned it with a glare sharp enough to Julian. "He calls my success theft," Morelli muttered later. "He forgets I tasted her gnocchi when I was 13, and that I never forgot them." Next came Lena Vinetti, the sous chef with hands too graceful for butchering rabbits and eyes too curious for comfort. She greeted me with a smirk and an accent that had taken its time crossing the Atlantic. Her hair was tied back in a silk scarf, Venetian green. "Fritz told me you'd be clever," she said. "I've always liked clever men." "Thanks," I said. "And I've always liked kitchens that don't serve threats with the linguine." She laughed softly. "You'll find no villains here, only cooks." Lena was a puzzle I'd have to solve later, once I figured out which part she played, the lover, the loyalist, or the liar. Then there was Jasper Nils, the critic. He wasn't on the premises, but his shadow was. His name came up in hushed insults and veiled jabs. Morelli had refused him an early tasting before the critic's deadline. Jasper had responded with a column that described the trattoria's opening as technically competent, but spiritually hollow. I made a note to follow up with Mr. Nils directly, preferably after lunch, but before he made more enemies with a pen. By the time I left, the ingredients had lined themselves up nicely: a chef scorned, a lover guarding secrets, and a critic with bruised pride and a vendetta. And somewhere between them, someone had slipped a knife into a pot of boiling noodles and left a message. I stepped out into the street and pulled my coat tighter. Wolfe was going to hate this one. It smelled too much like human ambition, and not nearly enough like orchids. By the time the lunch shift had wound down and the staff began clearing the wreckage like veterans after a skirmish, I found myself with a few private moments to snoop around. Call it instinct, or maybe Wolfe's influence, but I've learned that secrets tend to hide not in drawers or safes, but in trash bins, where people assume nobody elegant enough to drink sherry would ever stoop. Behind the kitchen, near the loading door, I found a steel can stuffed with damp parchment, lemon rinds, and the sort of secrets that burn poorly. I pulled out a half-scorched sheet with handwriting still legible in parts, cursive, sharp enough to slice and edits made in a hurry. The heading read, Gnocchi di Lucca, Riserva Privata. I raised an eyebrow. Below it, flour amounts were scratched out and replaced. Ratios were altered. A note in the margin read, too soft, must firm with yolk, in what looked like a different hand. And that's when I saw it. The phrase, rose water essence, only for finish, had been added in another line. Not exactly your average Italian flourish. Fritz had told me only 2 chefs in New York even kept Aquadel Rose in their pantry. One of them was named Morelli, the other made his home at West 35th Street and hadn't set foot in a public restaurant since Coolidge. I folded the page and slipped it into my coat pocket. I'd let Wolfe sniff it later, figuratively and otherwise. As I made my way back toward the dining area, the kitchen felt different. The clamour had died down, but the tension hadn't. This place wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a battlefield disguised in white aprons and copper pans. And someone was editing recipes not to improve them, but to claim them. I found Lena leaning against the walk-in cooler, arms crossed, lips pursed, an expression like she'd just caught me peeking into her diary. She smiled when I approached, like I was a souffle she might overwhip just for fun. "Enjoying the tour?" she asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I gave her the sort of look that invited confessions or flirtation. Either would work. She tilted her head. "You think I'm involved." "Do I?" I asked innocently. "You ask questions with your eyes, Mr. Goodwin. And you answer with misdirection." She stepped closer. Morelli's trouble didn't begin when the knife hit the noodles. It started the moment he came to New York. That was a nice line, but it didn't answer anything. Still, I didn't push. She wasn't ready to talk. Yet. Ricardo Fontana, on the other hand, was more forthcoming, mostly in volume and righteous indignation. "I was at the market all morning," he barked. "I buy my own basil." Morelli's basil tastes like paint. "You weren't near the kitchen?" "Ask anyone," he said, gesturing wildly. "They'll tell you. I was buying real food, not rewriting history. When a man protests too much, I usually start writing his name in bold. But Fontana's alibi seemed rehearsed, not forged. Back outside, I phoned Saul Panzer. If Wolfe had a bloodhound, Saul wore a tie and didn't bark. I gave him the name Jasper Nils and told him to trail him quietly, meaning no clipped press badges or brooding looks that drew suspicion. "See if the critic is as bitter as his column," I said. "Is there any other kind?" Saul replied, then hung up. I leaned against the alley wall and let the city hum around me. A rival who shouts, a sous chef who flirts, and a critic who hides. Something told me Wolfe's table was about to get a whole lot more crowded, and it wouldn't be for dinner. Wolfe hadn't yet spoken to Morelli directly, and truth be told, he likely hadn't intended to. He had let me do the legwork, as always, with the understanding that only a case requiring orchids or Fritz's honor would rouse his genuine interest. Then the phone rang, and everything changed. It was Saul Panzer. His voice, which usually carried the calm of a man who could track a ghost through Grand Central, had acquired an edge. "I just got word from a source in Midtown Precinct. Ricardo Fontana's dead." That gave me pause. "What do you mean, dead?" "I mean found this morning, face down in a vat of tomato sauce, in his restaurant's kitchen, stabbed in the back." "With a carving knife?" "According to the coroner's note, same brand as the one from Morelli's kitchen, handle color matches, identical model." I thanked him and hung up, then turned to Wolfe, who had been listening, of course, without pretending not to. "Well," I said, "that's one less suspect." He closed his eyes and steepled his fingers. "That is one more corpse. Your arithmetic is askew." By the time I arrived at Fontana's bistro, the police had already come and gone, and the place was closed tighter than Wolfe's wallet on a Tuesday. But Wolfe had long since taught me that murder scenes rarely ended at the chalk outline. Sometimes they started with what clung to the air. The scent hit me before I even stepped into the kitchen: tomato, garlic, and something else, something soft, floral. I moved toward the industrial vat where Fontana's body had been pulled out just hours before. The sauce had settled in thick, red silence, no longer boiling, but still warm. On the counter beside it was a spoon, discarded mid-motion, stained with the last stir. I dipped a finger along the handle and brought it to my nose. It was there, light, fragrant, and unmistakable. Aquadel rose, not a lot, just enough for a finish. A subtle infusion to give an old-world illusion of elegance, not common in tomato-based sauces, and certainly not in Fontana's usual rustic style. This wasn't his signature, it was someone else's. I had smelled it once before, on a damp, scorched parchment pulled from Trattoria di Luca's trash. A rose by any other name might smell as sweet, but this one reeked of murder and sabotage. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the details for Wolfe while he eviscerated a Paphia pedilum with his customary grace. "He was stabbed once," I said. "Clean entry between the ribs. The sauce was already simmering when he hit it." Wolfe's lips compressed. "Crude, but effective." "And then there's this," I added, placing the scorched recipe parchment on his desk beside my notes. "The ingredient list overlaps with the sauce, the final flourish, Aquadel rose." His eyes flicked down, reading the handwriting with the mild scorn he reserved for poor spelling, non-linear logic, and anyone who doubted the superiority of Fritz's risottos. "Fontana was not a man of subtlety," Wolfe said. "He would not have ended a sauce with this." Which means someone tampered with the pot before or after the stabbing. "Not tampered, Mr. Goodwin, framed." He leaned back and rested a thumb against his chin. If Fontana was preparing a dish with that herb, it was not for guests, it was for show, for mimicry. To pin it on Morelli? On Morelli, or anyone who might share a similar culinary fingerprint. "Fritz?" I asked, trying to mask my tone. He scowled. "Certainly not, but someone might hope to cast the shadow. Tell me again, who had access to that herb?" "Only 2 people in New York," I said. "One keeps it behind a locked pantry on West 35th. The other is our charming Italian client who now looks like a murderer." Wolfe lifted the corner of the parchment between 2 fingers and squinted at the ink. "It is never enough to smell the rose, Archie," he murmured. "One must also know who plucked it and why." When I broke the news to Fritz, he dropped a copper pot on the kitchen tile, which, knowing Fritz, was the equivalent of a full-blown nervous breakdown. "Riccardo Fontana? Dead?" he repeated, his hands trembling near the drawer where he kept his Sabatier knives. I nodded. "Murdered in his own kitchen, stabbed, same knife that was found in Morelli's noodles. And, this part you won't like, the sauce had Aquadel rose in it." He went pale. "That herb," he said, voice shaking, "has not left this house in months, except—" He looked at me with sudden horror. "Except I gave a sealed jar of it to Chef Morelli last week." As a gift I nodded again. He lowered himself onto the stool, his expression stiff, as if someone had swapped his bones for uncooked spaghetti. "You believe someone is trying to frame Gianni?" he asked. I didn't answer. Instead I turned to Wolfe, who had been unusually still, staring at the charred recipe fragment I'd returned to his desk. He didn't look up when he spoke. "Someone," he said, "is attempting something more nuanced than mere framing. They are smearing a man's reputation across 2 kitchens and using Fritz's generosity as the thread." Fritz looked up. "Then you must help him, sir. I beg you." Wolfe's eyes, finally, met his. For a moment, something passed between them, a bond rarely seen, never spoken. Then he stood, which, given the laws of physics and pride, meant something extraordinary was about to happen. "Very well," Wolfe said. "Mr. Goodwin, you may tell Chef Morelli that I am formally accepting this case, not as a courtesy, as a necessity, understood?" I said. "And Saul?" "Trailing Jasper Nils. Recall him. But Nils is not our man. His pen is sharper than his carving knife, and his ego does not lend itself to quiet sabotage." Wolfe returned to his chair and poured a small brandy. "Bring Saul home. We need him for something that demands more subtlety than surveillance." "Such as?" He looked at the rose water jar on his desk. "Such as tracing the scent of treachery." By noon the next day, Saul was back in the office, wearing the same tweed he'd left in. He dropped into the red chair with the look of a man who'd chased ghosts and come back with receipts. "He's clean," Saul said. "Jasper Nils spent the entire morning of the murder holed up in a restaurant supply warehouse on Hudson. He was inspecting imported linens, some bizarre editorial piece on the tactile ethics of dining." I blinked. "He alibied himself with tablecloths?" Saul shrugged. "They have the sign-in sheet, surveillance cameras, witnesses. Unless the man can be in two places at once and still nitpick hemstitching, he didn't kill Fontana." Wolfe gave a curt nod. "He didn't." "And?" I asked. "And," Saul continued, "he hasn't spoken to anyone involved in this case since the bad review. He's bitter, but not active." "So," I said, leaning back, "the only venom he's spilled is on paper." "Exactly." I turned to Wolfe. "Which leaves?" He didn't answer directly, but his glance lingered on the charred recipe page again. We had ruled out the critic. The rival was dead. And the ingredient, Aquadel rose, still floated through the air like a clue too fragrant to ignore. That evening, Wolfe summoned me back to the office with the kind of voice he usually reserves for overdue invoices or when Fritz forgets to blanch the asparagus before roasting it. He tapped the scorched recipe page, then a second document now beside it, something I hadn't seen before. It was an earlier version of the same gnocchi recipe, copied out in a different hand. Fritz's, to be exact. "Morelli gave me this 2 weeks ago," Wolfe said, "as a token of gratitude." I leaned in. The differences were subtle, but unmistakable. The original recipe bore Tuscan phrasing, flour ratios leaning traditional, and no mention of Aquadel rose. The floral addition was an edit, Wolfe said, a trap, buried in gourmet. Buried by who? Someone who wanted to ruin Morelli's standing by making him look like a plagiarist, then a poisoner. "So, Fontana?" Wolfe shook his head. Number Fontana was a pawn. He accused Morelli publicly, but he had no knowledge of this document. He pushed a third paper forward, notes from Saul, detailing an anonymous submission sent to a culinary magazine last month. A recipe almost identical to the doctored one in Morelli's trash, but the author's address. "Registered to Lena Vinetti," I read aloud. Wolfe grunted. "She tried to publish the recipe under a pseudonym. She added the rose water to make it hers. When Fontana found out, he blackmailed her. When he got greedy, she silenced him with Morelli's knife. And dragged Fritz into it by using the herb." "Exactly." I stood there, staring at the sequence like a crossword I'd just cracked. Wolfe didn't look up. "She wrote the threat," he said softly. "And if I know my women in desperation, she's already planning the next move." I adjusted my tie. "Then it's time we planned ours." The day after Fontana's dive into marinara eternity, Wolfe refused breakfast, which by itself was enough to prompt a call to Dr. Vollmer. He had also locked himself in the orchid room for 2 hours longer than usual, emerging with a stack of culinary texts and a glower that could curdle milk. The orchids, I suspect, had absorbed a new theory through osmosis. By mid-morning, Wolfe had commandeered the globe stand by his desk, replacing the Atlantic Ocean with a dictionary of Tuscan idioms and an annotated volume titled Regional Italian Cookery, Dialect, Doctrine, and Deception. He grunted occasionally, turned pages like he was dissecting betrayal one vowel at a time, and summoned me only to fetch more espresso or locate an obscure recipe pamphlet from the 1940s. He wasn't just rereading recipes, he was reinterpreting a crime scene in the syntax of sauté. "Observe," he finally said, gesturing with his pencil. "Here, semolino gonfiato, swollen semolina, a term used only in Lucca, but in the margin of Morelli's charred note we find farina troppo soffis, flour too soft. It is not synonymous." "Okay," I said, perching on the edge of the red chair. "So someone tried to rewrite the Gnocchi Code? Someone who is not from Lucca, someone attempting to pass as one who is." He marked another passage with slow precision. "And here, Rosolato versus Imbiondito both describe lightly browning garlic, but the latter is Venetian." That gave me pause. So we're talking about someone who knows Italian cuisine just enough to fake regional specificity, but not enough to fool you. "Not enough to fool a cook from Lucca," Wolfe said, "or me." He slid the burnt note toward me and tapped the lower right corner with his pencil. "Now, that signature? It is not ink, it is pressed oil." I leaned closer. He was right. A faint circular smudge had left a residue, not pen but olive oil. Pressed into the paper while warm, not deliberate, a byproduct of haste. "You think it was signed in a kitchen?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that someone composed this forgery in anger, under time pressure, and in a kitchen where regional dialect was not native." "Meaning?" "Meaning the fraud is not Morelli." He leaned back, content, like a man who had just found mold on a rare cheese and decided it was a sign of excellence. "But the one who forged the recipe," he added, "knew enough about culinary politics to frame Morelli with ingredients that pointed to Fritz. And that," I said, "narrows the list down to a—" He didn't reply. He just tapped his finger once on the word imbiondito, as if the clue had already confessed. That evening, after Fritz prepared a dinner that was less about nourishment and more about nervous distraction, chicken piccata served with quiet dread, Wolfe summoned me to the office with a single word. Venetian. I arrived with notepad in hand, ready to transcribe a monologue if necessary. Wolfe was seated, hands steepled, brow furrowed deeper than usual. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "how fluent are you in the geography of vanity?" "I know the landscape." "Then consider this, imbiondito, a Venetian term, not used in Tuscany, not by Morelli, certainly not by Fontana, who was Calabrian, and Fritz, he considers it an affectation. So whoever wrote the note, burned the recipe, and used the rose water, didn't just want to frame Morelli, they wanted to use Morelli's tools to make it look authentic." Wolfe nodded. "And failed." I flipped through my notes. "You're thinking, Lena." "Not thinking, deducing." He reached for a second sheet, the call slip from Saul Panzer. Saul had delivered a short report earlier. Jasper Nils was at a private tasting across town during the time of Fontana's murder. 10 witnesses, alibis sealed like a jam jar. "Lena Vinetti," Wolfe said, "worked in Venice before moving to New York. She was once Fontana's protégée, then she joined Morelli. She has the means, the dialect, and the motive. To get revenge? To reclaim credit for a recipe?" "No," Wolfe said. "To reclaim a reputation." She was accused of theft in Florence, silenced by Morelli's patronage. But if she could ruin him publicly under the guise of professional collapse, she'd be absolved without lifting a finger. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The trap, I could tell, was already setting. Wolfe looked up. "We will invite them all here. Tell Fritz to plan a meal." "Should I have Saul bring flowers?" "No," Wolfe said. "Just vinegar. We'll need it for the dressing. And perhaps the tone." The trouble with digging into the past is that you're never quite sure what's compost and what's still sprouting. Lena Vinetti's resume was polished, curated, and, like the best sugar sculpture, designed to crack under just the right pressure. Fortunately, I've developed something of a knack for tapping just the right spots. A few phone calls, a discreet lunch with a former sous chef in Astoria, and a chat with an importer of truffle oils got me what Wolfe would call a stew of significance. Lena had first come to New York 5 years earlier from Florence, though her family hailed from Venice. Her earliest jobs were in pastry, Tuscany, Rome, then Milan. It was in Florence that she met Riccardo Fontana, who was, at the time, the darling of a modest but rising trattoria near Santa Croce. The two collaborated, briefly and brilliantly, on a regional menu that caught the attention of food critics and an American investor with more money than taste. But the arrangement soured faster than a forgotten Zabaglione. Fontana accused Lena of stealing his gnocchi recipe, his mother's, allegedly, just before a key review dropped. The fallout: Lena vanished from Florence, and Fontana's restaurant closed within the year. 2 years later, Lena resurfaced in New York, quietly, under a different sponsor. The sponsor, Gianni Morelli, who had just signed his lease for Trattoria Di Luca. Now that was curious. They never publicly acknowledged working together before. Lena's name was buried beneath layers of kitchen staff on early menus. But the more I looked, the more her influence seeped through, particularly on one dish, gnocchi di Luca, which bore a remarkable resemblance to the one from Florence, down to the final sage butter drizzle. The same gnocchi recipe Fontana had claimed was stolen, which meant one of two things. Lena had indeed stolen the recipe, and Morelli had used it knowingly, or she had written it herself, and both men had tried to claim it. Whatever the truth, there was no denying a pattern. Lena had switched allegiances once. Fontana had smeared her name. Morelli had lifted her in silence. And now Fontana was dead in a pot of doctored tomato sauce, and Morelli stood to lose everything by association. Add to that a suspicious recipe note, a Venetian phrase, and a rose-scented culinary signature? Yeah. The past was definitely back on the stove, and Lena had forgotten to turn the heat down. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had rearranged his entire schedule to accommodate something far more pressing than orchids: truth. He sat with a fresh glass of beer, a notepad, and the recipe parchment under a small brass paperweight shaped like a piglet, a gift from Fritz that no one acknowledged. I gave him the full report, start to finish: Lena's fallout in Florence, her quiet sponsorship by Morelli, and the gnocchi in question that somehow linked them all. Wolfe closed his eyes and spoke as if composing a symphony in reverse. "She was accused of theft," he murmured. "Publicly disgraced. Fontana made certain of it." "And yet," I added, "the very same gnocchi made it onto Morelli's menu. Because he trusted her? Or used her?" "Hard to say," I replied. "But if she was the true creator of the recipe, and both men tried to claim it, then murder," Wolfe concluded, "became a form of reclamation." He opened his eyes. Fontana may have offered silence in exchange for obedience until he saw opportunity. Blackmail? Evidently, he knew her secret and wielded it. He might have threatened to expose her past unless she distanced herself from Morelli, or worse, delivered a final blow. And she responded by delivering him into a vat of tomato sauce. "Not immediately," Wolfe said. "She tried to frighten Morelli first. Hence the knife in the pot, the theatrical threat. But it failed. So she escalated." "No," Wolfe said sharply. "She was cornered. When Fontana's demands grew unbearable, or when he threatened to go public anyway, she silenced him. By using the carving knife from Morelli's kitchen. Precisely. She planted the Aquadel rose, a finishing note she knew would tie back to both Morelli and Fritz. She wanted a double illusion, culinary and emotional. Clever. Desperate, Wolfe corrected. I watched him now with the same quiet awe I get whenever Wolfe crosses the river of deduction and sets up camp on certainty. "She used a dialect she once owned but could no longer control," he said. "She composed a forgery with passion, not precision. Because she wasn't trying to perfect a dish, she was trying to erase 2 men from her life." Wolfe picked up the parchment again and tapped the oil stain. "And still," he said, "she left behind her thumbprint. A smear of oil, her vanity pressed in haste." There was silence in the room, but it wasn't empty. "I assume you intend to serve dinner?" I asked. Wolfe nodded once. "With Fritz's assistance, you will extend the invitation." "To whom?" "To all the players," Wolfe said. "And to Miss Vanetti. our unfortunate chef de sabotage. Invitations from Nero Wolfe are about as common as dancing lessons from a grizzly. When he sends one, on embossed cream stationery with Fritz's calligraphy and an absence of RSVP instructions, it lands with the weight of a summons. The guest list included Gianni Morelli, Lena Vinetti, Jasper Nils, and a food blogger named Cara Miles, who had once called Morelli's truffle risotto emotionally manipulative. I questioned that addition, but Wolfe claimed she was a necessary variable. Translation: she had opinions and a sharp tongue, ingredients that might bring something to a simmer. Fritz, to his credit, was all in. Once Wolfe explained the stakes and assured him the integrity of his pantry would be restored in due course, he agreed to prepare the menu. It was to be a tasting, 5 small plates, each carefully composed, each with a history. Wolfe planned it like a military campaign. First course, crostini di fegatini, rustic and unmistakably Tuscan. Second, gnocchi di Lucca, made with semolina, not flour. The difference, Wolfe insisted, would not go unnoticed by anyone with a claim to its origins. The third course, of course, was the bait. Fritz prepared penne al pomodoro with a finishing splash of aquadelle rose. It was subtle, just a whisper of floral scent, but unmistakable to anyone who knew their sauces and their sins. The aroma would hang in the air like a question. The plan, as Wolfe detailed it in between sips of saffron tea, was not to confront, but to provoke. To let the dish speak first, a culinary polygraph. "You believe she will recognize it?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said. "I believe she will comment on it, and she will say too much." "She's that confident?" "She is that desperate," Wolfe said. "Confidence born of necessity is brittle. One pushes it, and it shatters." The guests arrived promptly. Wolfe's reputation, if nothing else, ensured punctuality. The dining room had been rearranged to allow for Wolfe's preferred view of the entire table while remaining comfortably seated. I handled introductions and small talk. Lena arrived last. She was dressed in pale green, her tone crisp but cordial. When she leaned over to greet Morelli, he offered only a nod, one of those Italian nods that carried several chapters of unread history. During the first course, Wolfe remained silent, observing. By the second, the wine had loosened Jasper Nils's tongue, enough to mention how authentic the gnocchi felt. Lena gave a tight smile. Then came the third plate. As Fritz placed the penne before each guest, I watched Lena's expression. At first, nothing. Then she lifted the fork and paused, nostrils faintly flaring. "This scent," she said, half to herself. "It's curious." Morelli looked puzzled. "You don't recognize it?" Lena hesitated. "Of course, aquadelle rose, but I thought—" She stopped. Everyone was watching her now. Wolfe chose that moment to speak. "Curious, yes," he said, voice smooth as aged balsamic. "Particularly when one considers the rosewater was taken from my own kitchen, without permission." Silence. Then Wolfe added, "I suppose the question is, who would know where Fritz keeps his keys?" Lena's fork remained suspended mid-air, her fingers suddenly very still. The trap had sprung, and the next course wouldn't be served on a plate. Wolfe rarely dined with guests. The man considered it a violation of personal sanctity, like lending out one's toothbrush. But tonight he made an exception, not for company, but for combat. The dining room had been prepared with all the elegance Fritz could muster, which meant it looked like a Michelin inspector's fever dream. But beneath the crystal and candlelight, the table was a chessboard, and every guest a piece. Wolfe took his usual seat at the head, which gave him a commanding view of every gesture, twitch, and hesitation. He did not eat, not really. He dissected the courses as one might dissect an alibi. One by one the plates came out, and with them the cracks in composure. Gianni Morelli was trying too hard to seem calm. Jasper Nils had the nervous air of a man unsure whether he was invited for insight or indictment. Lena Vinetti? She was the picture of cool elegance. Too cool, if you asked me. Her smile was timed, her compliments rehearsed, and her fork barely touched the food. That, in this house, was more damning than a signed confession. Wolfe made no small talk. That, too, was strategy. Let the silence cook them, like a covered pot on a slow burner. The third course came, penne with Wolfe's requested infusion. The room warmed slightly from the scent of tomato and garlic, but also from the barely there floral finish. It was not overpowering, just a whisper of roses. That's when Wolfe leaned forward and spoke for the first time since seating. "Miss Finetti," he said, voice velveted with steel, "does this dish strike you as familiar?" She glanced up, caught mid-sip. "Familiar, perhaps, though not typical of your house style." "And yet the finish," Wolfe said, "it reminds you of something?" She hesitated. "It's Aquadel Rose, isn't it?" Wolfe inclined his head. "You were quite correct. A rare finish, reserved for particular occasions?" She offered a light smile. "It's subtle, but yes, I've used it myself." Morelli turned his head. "You said once you hated it." "Did I?" she said quickly. "Perhaps I meant for seafood." Wolfe cleared his throat gently. The room turned toward him like the moment before a verdict. "It was used in the sauce that carried Fontana's body," he said softly. "And in a forged recipe, written in haste and dialect not native to Tuscany, a recipe bearing your linguistic fingerprint, Miss Finetti." The smile slipped. The conversation had left the realm of politeness. The knives on the table were suddenly ceremonial. For a man who claims to disdain theatrics, Wolfe has a talent for timing. He let Lena's silence stew just long enough to over-reduce. Then, without raising his voice, he dropped the sprig of truth like a bay leaf into the pot. "The Aquadel Rose was stolen from my pantry," he said. "A locked pantry. The only duplicate key resides in Fritz's possession." Lena's eyes narrowed, but not in confusion. She was calculating. "Anyone could have added it?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "Few would dare. Fewer would know where to find it." He turned his gaze to Morelli. "Chef, in your establishment, would any of your staff dare to rifle through your private herb stores?" Morelli blinked. "Of course not. That is sacred." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And in this house even more so." Fritz, standing in the doorway behind Wolfe's chair, gave a solemn nod. I'd seen that look before, betrayal mixed with disappointment. It carried more sting than rage ever could. Lena placed her napkin on the table with careful precision. "You're accusing me of what? Of theft? Of culinary heresy?" "Of planting a narrative," Wolfe replied, "layered in flavors designed to convict two men at once, one with a rival's blood on his hands, the other with a rare herb on his shelf." "You think I killed Ricardo?" Wolfe tilted his head. "I think you were tired of men writing your story for you. Fontana defamed you, Morelli used you, so you decided to end the tale on your own terms." She laughed, a brittle, precise sound. "And my supposed motive? You mean beyond pride, justice, and preservation?" He leaned forward slightly. "The gnocchi, Miss Finetti. The one recipe both men tried to own. It was yours, wasn't it?" Lena didn't answer, but her hand curled slowly around her wine glass, not to drink, but to anchor herself. Wolfe sat back. "You once said to Mr. Goodwin, 'There are no villains here, only cooks.' You were wrong." The silence that followed was thicker than bechamel. It lingered until I saw it, that flicker of something behind her eyes, not fear, not quite guilt, recognition. The dish, the herb, the dialect, it was all her, and she had finally tasted the consequences. I've seen suspects fumble in all kinds of ways, sweaty palms, cracked voices, sudden trips to the powder room. But the most damning mistake is always verbal. It's the one they don't mean to make. After Wolfe's subtle dismantling, Lena tried to recover. "If I were trying to frame someone, I wouldn't have used a knife so obviously traceable to Morelli." "You didn't know it was traceable?" I said. "Not until the police noted the handle color in their report." She flinched, just barely. Morelli turned to her, confused. How would you know what kind of knife it was? I didn't say that, Lena replied quickly. You said so obviously traceable, Wolfe repeated. The knife's brand and design were not released publicly. That detail was withheld at my request. The press referred only to a kitchen knife. The table had gone still. Jasper Nils reached for his wine but thought better of it. Cara Miles looked like she was about to ask for a quote, but wisely kept quiet. I read it online. No, Wolfe cut in. You remembered it. Because you used it. Lena's mouth opened, then closed. Fritz spoke for the first time all evening. That knife, he said softly, was part of a set my mother gave me in Salzburg. I keep it in the third drawer, wrapped. Lena turned toward him, and for a moment her composure cracked. Not into guilt, into something else. Regret. You weren't supposed to be part of it, she said. Fritz blinked. But you made me part of it. Wolfe stood, not quickly, but with purpose. There will be no further courses, he announced. This dinner has concluded. Lena didn't protest. She reached for her purse, slowly, deliberately, and as she stood she looked not at Wolfe nor Morelli, but at me. You're good, she said. I gave a shrug. The house has its standards. As she left the room, escorted by a silence heavier than handcuffs, Wolfe turned to me. Inform Inspector Kramer in the morning, he said. Let her sleep one last night with freedom in her teeth. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, Tell Fritz to open the Chianti. I believe he's earned it. Back in the office, Wolfe did what he always did after an evening of psychological combat. He poured a glass of beer and spoke as if lecturing an invisible graduate seminar in criminal gastronomy. I took my usual chair, notepad in hand, though by now I could have ghost-written the whole deduction with one eyebrow raised. You observed, he began, that Miss Vanetti made 3 fatal errors. First, her use of Aquadel Rose, a culinary fingerprint traced to precisely 2 men. Second, a Venetian term in a recipe purporting to originate from Lucca. And third, a casual reference to a knife brand not publicly disclosed. He swirled the glass, but didn't sip. Each misstep, subtle in isolation. Together, a signature. I nodded. Signed with oil and ego. He ignored the quip. She forged a recipe to appear as Morelli's, but she lacked the restraint necessary to make it convincing. Her edits were emotional, not editorial. Flour softened with yolk, notes in conflicting dialects. It was sabotage disguised as authorship. And the goal? Discreditation, Wolfe said. She sought to ruin Morelli's name in his prime, and implicate Fritz by extension, humiliating both. Fontana, however, complicated her plan. I raised an eyebrow. Because he figured her out. Wolfe nodded. He recognized her style, perhaps even her plot, and used it as leverage. A petty man, and arrogant. He thought he could control her. Instead, he pressed her into a corner. She escalated, I said, knife in Noodles, then knife in Fontana. Precisely. The initial threat was meant to intimidate. When it failed, and Fontana grew bold, she resorted to finality. She didn't just kill him, I said. She curated the crime. Wolfe allowed himself a flicker of approval. She used Fontana's own vat of sauce, added the rose water herself, and planted the weapon from Morelli's kitchen. All while banking on the chaos of restaurant rivalries to muddy the waters. He sighed. She underestimated how quickly clarity rises to the surface when one understands taste, tone, and timing. Fritz entered with fresh beer, the movement as quiet and reverent as a priest handling relics. He set the glass down and paused. She? He began. Wolfe looked up. Fritz continued. She knew where I kept the pantry key. I'd shown her once, years ago, after Morelli recommended her. She said she needed saffron and I... Wolfe lifted a hand. No apology required. Trust is not a flaw, merely a risk. Fritz nodded once and left the room. Wolfe didn't touch the beer. She will not go to prison, he said. Not tonight. She murdered a man, I replied. She also built a recipe no man could truly steal and destroyed it herself. I leaned back. So now what? Now, Wolfe said, we shall see how far remorse can ferment before becoming rot. The next morning, Lena Vinetti returned to the brownstone uninvited, which is the closest thing to bravery Wolfe respects. She wore the same pale green, but none of the composure. Fritz served tea. She did not touch it. I know you could have me arrested, she said. I could, Wolfe replied, but you haven't. No. She paused. Why? Because I am not fond of public theatre, Wolfe said, nor of wasting time when private resolution is within reach. He handed her a sheet of paper, typed, double-spaced, with 3 clauses, a full confession, the return of the original gnocchi recipe to Morelli by notarized statement, and a withdrawal from the culinary field for a period no less than 5 years. Self-exile? She asked. Self-preservation, Wolfe said. Call it what you like. She read the page in silence. I watched her mouth move through the clauses. And if I refuse? Then Inspector Kramer receives everything by noon. Lena sat perfectly still for 30 seconds. Then she signed. No tears, no tantrums. Just a whisper of breath escaping, like a souffle collapsing. I once loved cooking, she said. You loved control, Wolfe corrected. The confusion was yours. She left with the signed confession tucked into her handbag. As the door clicked shut, Wolfe finally lifted his tea. Justice, he said, is a dish best served without ceremony. I raised my mug. And with a touch of rose water? He grunted. Archie, if you ever speak those words again, I will have Fritz reassigned to a sanatorium. Noted. And that was that. No headlines, no sort of handcuffs, just another case, signed, sealed, and silenced. Wolfe doesn't give speeches. He considers public praise as indecent as public bathing. So when he rose from the head of the dining table, after dessert no less, and cleared his throat, I set down my fork and checked the calendar. He looked at Fritz. For many years, Wolfe began, this house has functioned as more than a residence. It has been a haven, a fortress, a stage, and a kitchen. Fritz blinked. So did I. I do not say it often, Wolfe continued, but it is a fact as firm as my distaste for the outdoors. The success of this household owes more to your discretion than to my intellect. I regret that your name was dragged into this affair, but I am not surprised that you bore it with honor. Fritz stood still, eyes slightly glossy behind his usual reserve. Wolfe nodded once and sat down. There was no applause, just silence, thick with sincerity. It was, by Wolfe's standards, a standing ovation. Chef Gianni Morelli, to his credit, didn't grandstand. He met Wolfe's eyes across the table and gave a quiet nod, the kind men of his generation reserved for final toasts or funeral processions. After dinner, he pulled me aside in the hallway while Wolfe returned to his orchids. I've booked a return flight, he said. To Italy? He nodded. I've had my fill. This city is no place for food to breathe. Too many knives not used for cooking. You're not running, are you? No, he said. I'm retreating. There's a difference. I offered a hand. You'll be missed. He took it. By few, but I'll miss this place, even your boss. He'd never admit it, I said, but he respects you. I know, he replied. That's why I'm leaving while that remains true. He stepped into the night without fanfare. No paparazzi, no headlines, just a man with flour still on his soul and sauce stains in his past, choosing to bow out before the next course turned cold. Later that night, after Fritz had cleared the dishes and Wolfe had finished interrogating a stubborn orchid about bloom cycles, I poured myself a finger of bourbon and settled into my usual chair in the office. Case closed, I said. No, Wolfe replied. Case concluded. Closure is a fiction. Well, it was neat, maybe too neat. Justice is often inelegant, Wolfe said, but when one has the luxury of discretion, it can be plated properly. He reached for his beer, finally, and took a long sip, savoring it. You think Lena will keep quiet? I asked. She will, Wolfe said, because she knows that her reputation is salvageable only in silence. And if she doesn't? Then the authorities will receive a file so thorough it could garnish itself. I chuckled. You've been spending too much time around Fritz. He didn't dignify that with a response. We sat there for a moment, the house unusually still. No one looming in the hallway, no scandal in the kitchen, just two men who'd just seen another human storm weathered and diffused, without bloodshed, without sirens. You know, I said, for a case that started with a knife in a pot, this one came out almost poetic. Wolfe grunted. Poetry is the seasoning of truth, used sparingly. He raised his glass once more. To Fritz, he said, to the only man in New York whose virtue could survive both temptation and tomato sauce. I clinked my glass with his. And to you, Wolfe, still undefeated. He gave a modest snort. Only because I never enter games I do not intend to win. Fair enough. As I took my last sip, I caught sight of the orchid beside Wolfe's chair, a delicate white Miltonia just beginning to bloom. Justice, like orchids, I thought, doesn't shout, it whispers, and sometimes it smells like roses. Nero Wolfe once said that justice, like flavor, depends on balance. In the end, Lena Vinetti's greatest misstep wasn't the murder, it was mistaking control for clarity. She tried to rewrite a past through deception, but every forgery carries a flaw. And it was a single word, in the wrong dialect, that undid her. What do you think was Lena's greatest mistake? Trusting Morelli, underestimating Wolfe, or believing a stolen recipe could ever become her own? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your theory in the comments below. If this mystery stirred your appetite for more, don't forget to subscribe for weekly Nero Wolfe cases and share this story with someone who loves a slow burn deduction and a sharp finish. Until next time, keep your sources smooth, your facts sharper, and your secrets sealed.